So today's topic is kind of weird, in a good way. But David Childress and I both got fascinated by the phenomenon of cranial deformation that happened all over the world by cultures that didn't know each other. And on average, that was 2,000 years ago, but up until the 20th century, and then much, much farther back in time. And so the big question is why, and in every case, in every culture, it's the nobility whose children had their heads bound at birth to alter the shape to make them look different than the normal population. But how would you come up with an idea like that? Why not just wear a fancy hat or something? Because it's a very dangerous process. And what levels of experimentation were involved to see how fast you could do this, or at what point you killed the child. So this is the book that he and I co-authored. And all of the academics I know of in the world that talk about this subject say 100% of the cases of elongated heads is the result of head binding. But what's this? That's a mummy bundle, and look at the size of the head. This was sent to me 5 days ago. And that, the same, 5 days ago. It's actually located in a city hall in the city of Andahuaylas in the highlands of Peru. And it was my friend Pablo Seminario who sent it to me because he has a fascination for this subject as well. So literally this is the latest. And you see the size of the head compared to the body. That's not simply head binding, because the head is much, much larger than what it should be. So obviously something else is going on. And then this one as well. Look at the size of the head, and look at you see the protrusion on the forehead there. And there is a coronal suture, which is the one that goes across the front, but the one that's supposed to go backwards, the sagittal suture, doesn't exist at all. And any physician who's looked at that has said, I don't understand what this is. You know, I didn't learn this in medical school. But the great thing was that yesterday, I had a neurosurgeon come by my book table, and he looked at that and he just went, that's weird. But then he said, okay, the reason why the suture isn't there is that the body is pre-programmed to have an elongated head. So if there was a suture there, then that couldn't happen. So the lack of the suture means that the skull can continue to grow upwards and then be programmed to turn off. So that's an insight as of yesterday. So again, it's an ongoing thing. There is no end to it. Like the announcement that Nassim and I did today. You know, that's hot off the press kind of thing. So I decided to write my own book about the phenomenon of elongated skulls located in Peru and Bolivia, and to see if all of the cultures, again, is there a source culture where this begins? And then are they all related to one another? And in the meantime, I also wrote a book about Akhenaten, because anytime I would talk about elongated skulls, people would automatically say Akhenaten had an elongated head. It's like, what's this based on? Because his mummy has never been found. But he's trying to tell a story about that. And then I decided to write this one specifically about the Paracas culture of the coast of Peru, because they had the largest elongated skulls of anybody in the world. And they lived from they suddenly appear on the coast of Peru around 500 BC, and then they disappear about 100 AD. And when you ask archaeologists, well, where did they come from? Most of them will say from the highlands of Peru, from the culture of Chavin. And then the next question is, well, did the Chavin bind their skulls? No. So you're trying to tell me that these people moved from the highlands of Peru to the coast and then decided to bind their babies. That doesn't make sense. But the problem is, and actually the weird thing too is that no archaeologist I know of is actively studying this culture. I mean, it's one of the most bizarre and fascinating cultures in all of Peru, if not the world. I think they're honestly afraid of the subject. Because they had, this group appears on the coast of Peru in desert, where the area gets half an inch of rain a year. And they developed the finest textiles in all of the Americas. They knew the potter's wheel, and they knew metallurgy. And it's like, where did this all come from? There has to be a much more logical, larger understanding behind this. And beyond the Black Sea, because that's what we're going to get into when we get into the DNA results that we've been working on. So I have to dedicate this to my mentor. I spent almost every day for 6 years with him. And he was the world expert of the area of pre-Columbian culture. Because there were 5 different cultures that lived on the coast. There was the Paracas, then the Nazca, then the Wari, then the Chincha, then the Inca. And so we would go out into the field and we would find artifacts in some cases. In other cases, we would find recently opened tombs of these ancient cultures by tomb robbers. And so Senior Juan would methodically take photographs and send them to the Ministry of Culture of Peru to tell them that tomb robbing was occurring. And he never got a response from them because he was an amateur. But here he is holding what you can see is a very large baby's head. And strange idea, but Senior Juan had 5 elongated skulls in his collection. And I got on the internet and started to support him. And then eventually people started donating money for us to collect more of these skulls because literally people from the area would come to the museum with a skull in a bag and say, do you want to buy it? And so we would pay on average, I think, $40 for one of these. And the main reasoning was to study them, but also to make sure that they didn't get out of the country because it's illegal to ship these out of the country. But if they make it to Europe, they're worth $1,500. So in that way, we preserved the culture. So it's not only the size of the skull, but look at the color of the hair. When we got it, it was wrapped up in textile. And for 2 years, I asked Senior Juan, can we open it up? And he said, no, this belongs to the culture of Peru for the Ministry of Culture. And because he did this methodical recording of looted tombs and never got a response, he finally says, to hell with it, let's open it up. So we got a Peruvian archaeologist and a Peruvian forensic dentist to come and unwrapped it. And I thought it was going to have dark red hair, which is genetic to the Paracas, which shouldn't be there. Instead, it turns out to be strawberry blonde. And that is the hair color of that individual when they were alive. No Europeans or people of European ancestry were supposed to have landed on the coast of Peru until the conquistadors. So this is like 1,500 plus years before that. So obviously the migration pattern on the coast of Peru is much more complex than what we've been taught. Like everyone supposedly crossed the Bering Land Bridge and walked their way down to Tierra del Fuego. What about seafaring? Maybe? And so that's an exact cast. And the forensic dentist was able to figure out that the individual was about 20 months old and died 1,950 years ago. So this is the standard procedure of head binding from many different cultures. The two on the right are actually the way the Maya used to bind their baby skulls, because the Maya hierarchy did the same thing. And the one on the left is more of the, I think, the Flathead Indians of the west coast of the United States. And these are examples. There's a lady on the left from the Amazon basin in Peru, and you can see her little child on the right-hand side is still showing the marks of where the binding was done. It would, on average, take about 3 years to do this. And then in the middle is a lady from Vancouver Island in Canada. And then on the right, a literal Flathead Indian, which were people who lived in Washington, Oregon, and I think Idaho. Again, solely the noble class of people. And these, again, are the different techniques that were employed in order to perform. This is the theory, at least in Peru. If you go to Cusco, where there are elongated skulls, these are the different types of binding that they believed took place. And the strange one is the one on the left, where it's almost like a heart shape. I have no idea how that was done. And again, this kind of binding process. But when we get to the Paracas culture, and that's an example of one on the left-hand side, the volume of the skull is larger than normal. And you can't, no matter what you do, you can't force the skull to increase its volume. It's pre-programmed to close. And so obviously that's some kind of anomaly that we're starting to see. And again, head binding has been found in many parts of the world. Melanesia, Attila the Hun, the mound builders, the megalithic builders, throughout different sites in the west coast of Canada, west coast of the US, into Mexico, and of course the Andeans and the coast of Peru, and as well in parts of Africa. So in terms of Akhenaten, we know very well his bloodline. So he was born Amenhotep III, or fourth. His father was Amenhotep III. And what happened was, he was very, as many of you will know if you've read anything about Akhenaten, he was very rebellious. And he was immersed, because he was nobility, he was immersed in the secret schools of ancient Egypt. So he was given access to the entire history of Egypt, which goes much farther back than dynastic times. And so he decided, because his father, by the time his father was ruler, he was more or less a puppet of the nobility. What was called the Amen priesthood had taken the entire society over, and he had no real job. You know, he would say, well, I want to make a pronouncement. It's like, no, don't worry, we'll do it for you. Just, have fun, you're the king. And so Akhenaten, when he saw this happening to his father, he decided when he became the ruler that he was going to change things. So the first thing he did, I think, is he changed his name to Akhenaten, which means the shadow of Aten, because he knew there was a time period way before when the time of Aten existed. That was the time of full consciousness. And then after that, it's a cycle of 5 different stages. The 4th stage, okay, actually, Patricia will help me with this. The first stage is, the first stage is, like there are 5 stages of the sun. The sun isn't called Ra. Ra is a stage of the sun. So the first stage is Kepler, and that's the dung beetle rolling the dung ball, symbolic of the sun being brought into the heavens. And then next we have Ra, which is the rebellious aspect. It's the 5 stages of the sun, the 5 stages of a human life, and the 5 stages of the great cycle. So Ra is the 2nd stage. That is when it's being energized. Then we have Un, which is the 3rd stage. Then the 4th stage is Aten, which is complete fulfillment. And this relates to levels of consciousness too. And then finally, you have Amen, which is dusk and darkness. And that's symbolic in a lot of different ways. So the priesthood of Amen were the ones that ran the entire society. And Amen, from which we get Amen, is not thy will be done, it's let it remain hidden. So that's why you had to go to the priest in order to have an afterlife or have anything. They had total control. So he said, no, I'm taking us back to complete consciousness, Aten. So I am Akhenaten, I am the shadow. And of course, that's the way he's portrayed. Whether he looked that way, we don't know. But supposedly, when his sculptors wanted to represent him, he said, depict me as I am, compared to Ramses II, who said, make me look really big and strong and tough. So some people think he looks like a hermaphrodite. But whether he looked that way or not, we just don't know. But he may have suffered from what's called Marfan's syndrome, which is a disease which kind of contorts the way the skeleton and body develop. And that's the symbol of Aten. And Aten, he wasn't, a lot of people will say that he was the one that invented monotheism. He simply brought the concept back from the time of Aten. And the sun was not the god, the sun was the symbol of what the god represents, which is energy. Same thing with the Inca. The Inca didn't worship the sun. They knew the sun was a symbol of the creator. So it's quite a different meaning. And of course, the Amen priesthood left him alone for a while, but then they decided to basically wipe him off the map. They tried to erase the entire history of his existence. So defacing, being removed from kings' lists, stuff like that. And he also moved his capital city from Thebes to a place called Amarna, or Akhenaten. And again, most archaeologists think that he found a virgin piece of territory to do this, but there was a logic behind it. We've been there to Akhenaten, and it's a megalithic site. So again, symbolically, he was bringing the culture back to the time of power, to the time of those who knew how to do incredible things. And that's what the city more or less looked like. And by the time the Amen priesthood took him and Nefertiti and the 6 daughters and murdered them all, then it turned into that. They tried to literally wipe his existence off the map. But these depictions, there's Nefertiti wearing a crown that's a little bit big, and there's him, again, but the daughters are shown with bound heads, and they're elongated. So he's doing something symbolic here. And I think what he was doing, especially with the daughters, it's the busts of the daughters more than him. I think he was making a statement of, this is where I come from. Like, this is my genetic background. I go back to the time of the great ancient ones, and that's what they looked like. And anyway, you would have to have some kind of example to base this on. Inventing that shape would be difficult because anatomically it looks correct if you had an elongated head. And that is actually Tutankhamun. So you can see he did have an elongated head, a depression on the top of his head, and then his cerebellum in the back is distended. And you can go to the Valley of the Kings and see him to this day. But what the officials have done is they put a blanket underneath his head to hide the fact that his head looks different. But we have, there are X-rays that were taken. You can always get around these guys when they try to cover something up. There's always a mistake. So, though the area of the world that has the most elongated skulls is Peru and Bolivia. And you can see from that example, photo I illegally took in the back of the Ica Museum, all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And they could represent different levels of the society in terms of binding of the skull. And also, curiously, if you look at this line, going this way, the diagonal line, going from Cajamarca down to Potosi, Those are the locations of all of the megalithic sites in Peru and Bolivia. They're all in one line. And that's where you also, at every one of these ancient megalithic sites, you find elongated skulls. The other exception is over on the west coast here, Paracas and Cochabamba. So in South America, this is the oldest culture that probably did head binding, and they were called the Chinchorro. They lived on the coast of Chile about 6,000 years ago. But it's tough. I mean, that's very complex binding, so it is possible that there was a genetic component as well involved in it. Because to bind something and create that shape, you're altering the shape of the brain. And you could obviously also kill the child if you push it too far. Then that's near the salt flats in Bolivia, and you see that's simple head binding. You see where the back of the skull and the forehead are flattened. So that's not changing the volume, but that's changing the shape. And here again, the one on the right, you see flattening of the back of the skull and partial flattening of the forehead, but the one on the left is different. And this is the Huancarani culture that lived in Bolivia about 4,000 years ago. And this is at Pumapunku in Bolivia. See, that kind of looks like the Akhenaten shape to some degree. But there seems to be no genetic relationship between these cultures and the Paracas of Peru, because you can tell by comparing textiles and ceramics and stuff, there's always an influence from your ancestors, but in this case, completely different. And then this is an example at Silustani, which is near Lake Titicaca. And that's a 2-year-old child in a museum at Lake Titicaca. I think that one, there's no sagittal suture, so I think that one was born with an elongated head. And this one is called Waiki, and it's located in a museum in a little town called Andahuaylias. Waiki's head is the size of her torso. And look at the size of the eye sockets. And Waiki has been DNA tested 3 times, and we were able to get the maternal DNA 3 times. And the haplogroup, which is the genetic background, was B4, which is typical of Native Americans of that area. So the question is, what was dad? Unfortunately, the nuclear DNA, which is the paternal side, was unsuccessful in all 3 cases. But I think we're looking at an alien-human hybrid. How else can you explain it? Mom's full-blown normal human. Dad had to be something, very different, but able to breed with that population. So here you see the profile. Waiki's also missing 2 sets of ribs. And also the rib cage looks like it's turned upside down. And I had an anatomist come with me and see it. And he said, what the hell is this? And it's not fake. It's a real specimen that was found about 10 miles from where the museum is. And in Peru, nobody bothers trying to fake stuff. There's so much weird stuff in Peru anyway that, it's like, oh, you want to buy a skull? You want to buy a 2,000-year-old skull for $40? It's like, okay. So that's one of the reasons I love living there. It's just, you can get away with anything. Yeah. And the government doesn't care, except when we did the DNA testing. Then they cared a lot. But if you do anything official, it's like in Egypt. It's a nightmare. It's like, oh no, 10 more papers, has to go to 6 more desks, and then come back to me, and I've got my red stamp to put on it. We'll get into the DNA results, but that took 3 years. Just because of the bureaucracy, not because of the procedure we were doing. It's just wacko. And then that's the fontanelle. which is the top of the head. And you can see it's not closed. So in a normal baby, that would close at 2 years. So then you obviously say, well, I guess it was about 2 years old when it died. But again, look at the size of the eye sockets. And does a 2-year-old baby have molars? Nope. So again, if you're looking for something like, maybe an alien, but definitely a human something hybrid, you look for anomalies like that. And the teeth by itself is telling you something's really different about this. And also, this one was found in the same cemetery. It was a royal cemetery, and that was a 15-year-old girl. And that rather crude reconstruction was actually done on top of an actual skull. So it's not an artist's interpretation. They just built up from what they were working with. And these are located in what's called the Coricancha in Cusco, which was the Inca Holy of Holies, dated at the 15th century, but they've never been carbon-14 tested. So this again is an archaeologist presuming that it's Inca and it's from that time period. But one of the odd things here is the one on the far left. You see there's a suture line coming down the forehead, which is not normal whatsoever. And this one, that's about a 1.5-year-old baby that was found in the Cusco area, quite possibly Inca, but look at the size and the shape of it. If you tried to bind to get that shape, you would kill the child. So there has to be a genetic component in it of an ancestry of having an elongated head. And this is in a quarry actually near Ollantaytambo. Look at the one on the right-hand side. Look at the size of it in comparison to most of the others there. Absolutely massive. And this is another baby's head. One of the curious things we're going to keep seeing, again, is this protrusion in the forehead like that. And this one also, I think, is missing its sagittal suture going backwards. And then this is another collection in a town called Wari. You see the one in the middle, and the one to the right behind it, and the one in front on the left-hand side in comparison to the other ones. Like there's a major difference. And you also see a lot of ancient surgery that was like brain surgery that was going on. And now we're into the Paracas culture. These were on display in a little museum in the highlands of Peru. And I took these photos. And put them on the internet. And they went completely viral. And then we went back there a couple of years later and they were taken off display. And I asked the curator, I said, why have you taken them off display? He said, well, we want to preserve them in boxes in the basement, which is called cover-up. But anyway, I got to be able to film and photograph. And look at that. See, again, the head is almost the size of the torso. And I asked him what culture it was. And based on the textile style, he said Paracas. So that means the Paracas weren't simply on the coast of Peru. They were all the way up into the highlands as well. And that's a close-up of the head. That's not simple cranial head binding or deforming. It's a very complex shaping. So I think that person was born with an elongated head. And these are the most classic ones. These are in the Ica Museum in Peru. And they've been called Nephilim and Anunnaki and God knows what. But they were found in there's only one specific area of one cemetery in the world where these are found. And that's half an hour's drive from my house. So you see just the sheer volume of them, and you see the word Chongos on the forehead. That's the name of the cemetery. So I went to the archaeologist and I said, have you done any excavations at Chongos? And they said, no, we haven't. You know, why wouldn't you want to? And the backstory is even better because I said, well, if you haven't done excavations, how did you get these skulls? And he said, well, this tomb robber came in and sold them to us. And then I said, oh, okay. Well, did you hire him to take them to the exact location where they were found? And he said, no, he refused to do that. But if I wanted more, they could dig more up for them. So none of the archaeologists in Peru know where these are, but I do, because I hired the tomb robber and he took me. It's about a 20-acre area. That's it. There's no other place. So this is part of the collection that we have collected here. Almost all of them are examples of cranial deformation. And this is where Paracas is located, south of where you see it says Pisco. So it's the largest natural bay on the coast of Peru. Again, as I said, half an inch of rain a year. But these people were masters of agriculture. What they would do is they knew the water table was about 3 feet under the sand. So they would simply mark off an area to be where they wanted to grow food, and they would take the sand down to about 2.5 feet, plant the seeds, and then once the roots touched the water source, you didn't have to irrigate them. And that's also, we're going to see part of the secret of Nazca, because this is the Nazca area. And also, there's a plant that grows on the coast called totora, which is a reed. And from that, at Lake Titicaca, you can build boats. And this is one of the last of the great boat builders. But it's also located on the coast of Peru, in Paracas, and also cotton grows there and has done for 8,000 years. So there you have the raw materials for building a boat or a ship. And what we know, again, like it's through the artifacts. This is called spondula shell. It's only found on the coast of Ecuador. So how would it have gotten from Ecuador to Peru? One way would to be traded from one tribe to another all the way along. The other way would be to build a boat. The wind blows 80% of the time from the south to the north. 20% of the time it blows back south. So I think actually that the Paracas people were master navigators from a lineage, which we'll get into, and they simply would sail up the coast and bring things with them to trade, and they get the spondulus and gold and also emeralds and take them back down home, because we find those in the archaeological record in Paracas. And this is called the candelabra or candelabro. It's on the side of a mountain. It's 500 feet tall, and it's part of the Nazca system. The Nazca system of geoglyphs and lines go from Paracas all the way to Nazca. That's 200 miles. So most people just know of the so-called Nazca lines, which there are about 30 of, like the hummingbird and the monkey and the what else? Hummingbird, monkey. Well, and spider, exactly. But in between Paracas, where this is, and Nazca is an area called Palpa, and that's where the flat mountains are. And there are 1,600 of these geoglyphs there, much smaller, but very bizarre. Like they're anthropomorphic. There are left-hand turn signals. It's just like the whole landscape is these things. And those were created by the Paracas culture before the Nazca arrived. The Nazca arrived around the time of Christ, and it wasn't a happy experience. So this is the first one I ever saw in Senior Juan's museum, and it has natural red hair, and you see the complexity of the design of it. So I think, again, this is one that had quite a bit of natural elongated skull DNA in it. But of course, you would have mixing of cultures in this part of the coast, because a family can't keep inbreeding with each other, or else you wind up with deformities. So that's the process of what happened. Eventually, it was a small group probably that arrived at Paracas, and then over the course of time and generations, they would have to breed with outsiders who were Homo sapiens sapiens. Gradually, the skulls began to shrink, so then the head binding began in order to compensate, to make sure the royalty didn't look the same as the commoner. And this is another style found in Paracas. It could be cranial deformation. That is definitely cranial deformation. You see the flattening of the skull, the back of the skull and the forehead. And this was the last of the Paracas. At this point in time, they were probably 95% local indigenous people. But what's that? You know, cranial deformation, head binding. I think that's what the original ones looked like. Again, you see the protrusion in the forehead, large eye sockets, very robust, like very powerful jaw. And that's a comparison. One to the, like normal human on the left, early Paracas on the right. And this is just displaying again the sutures, the coronal suture coming across the front, and then the sagittal suture going down the back. And that's an elongated skull. There is no sagittal suture. Even if you look inside the skull, you can't see it. And ossification can happen over the course of time. Like this was a relatively older person, because you see the suture is starting to fill itself in with more calcium carbonate. But the one going backwards, it's simply not there. Also, we have what are called foramen, which are holes in our skulls. That's where nerve and blood flow come out, like to feed the face, because your spine is where the blood flow comes up. And so we have those in our mandible. You see where it says mental foramen. And the Paracas elongated skulls have them in the back. And probably the reason for that is because of the elongated skull. In order to properly feed in terms of blood flow, they had to have those foramen and special nerves coming through in order to feed that area. So that's a genetic feature, which disappears again once the normal human input exceeds that of the Paracas, then those disappear. And also this protrusion under here, which is where major muscles attach, is quite a bit bigger, because again you have that much larger skull that you're trying to hold up. And also this is called the foramen magnum. That's where your spinal column enters the bottom of your skull. So you see it's right in the balance point, which makes sense in terms of evolutionary development. But with the Paracas, they're an inch or more backwards or back. And that can't be the result of head binding. That has to be a genetic characteristic. So now we're starting to stray away from these being originally Homo sapiens sapiens, because that is not in anyone you know. And so this is the last of the cemeteries of the Paracas people. All the skulls have cranial deformation, and each one has evidence of a blow to the head. So this was a killing field. And what happened was, I'm getting more and more proof of this, was the Nazca people were people who lived a little bit farther north in a much more arid area. And climate change began to happen on the coast of Peru starting about 2,000 years ago. It started to get slowly drier and drier, and these people were forced out of their homeland. And what you see, you see the green fields in the background. That's agriculture that's 2,000 plus years old. Again, they lowered the elevation to get to the water table. So the Nazca took over and they slaughtered the nobility of the Paracas, which happens like lots of places, like the Romanov family in Russia. It's like, we're not going to put you in jail, we're just eradicate you. And then the Nazca take over the area. And the mystery of the Nazca disappearing about 500 AD is not because the spaceships came down and picked them up. It's because they didn't know how to farm very well. And as the area became more and more desert-like, they had to evacuate and go to the highlands of Peru, where there's lots of water. But some of the Paracas were able to escape. They weren't all in one area, and they became the root base of the Inca people, because the Inca performed cranial deformation of their children as well, until the Spanish government twice forced them to stop. So that's the famous astronaut. And the astronaut is actually three-dimensional. So that was created by the Paracas people. All of the enigmatic ones were done by the Paracas. The things like the spider is kind of obvious, but that one was made by the Paracas, and that is in Nazca. So that means the Paracas were all the way down into Nazca. So they must have developed a pretty big population over the course of time. And then this is in the Palpa area, and you see how playful the designs are. And again, they're three-dimensional. They're not just a scoop in the ground like the Nazca ones. These are much more complicated. And they had a ceremonial city called Cahuachi. And it's one of the largest ceremonial adobe cities in the world, which I'm sure most of you haven't heard of, but if you go to Nazca, you can visit it. This is one of 30 massive adobe temples they built. And found there during the excavations during the Nazca time, because the Nazca, of course, took over the ceremonial city, is they found the elongated skulls used as trophy heads. And what they now believe the Nazca did is, as they were screwing up their environment because they didn't know how to farm properly, they also defoliated the entire area. It was like African savanna with these trees which fixed nitrogen into the sand. So that's how you could get good agricultural production. But they chopped them all down to make fancy pottery. So they wiped themselves out. And what's believed now is that they dug up the ancient Paracas skulls and they used them for divination purposes, praying that they would bring the knowledge of agriculture and rain back. But that didn't work. And that's what a natural Paracas skull looks like. You see the dark red hair. Two hair experts have examined many examples of the red hair. And it's thinner than Native American hair. It's of a different cross-section shape. And it's naturally dark red. So that is Caucasian. So that means maybe the Paracas came from somewhere else. And that, again, there's the baby on the right-hand side that we saw earlier. Unfortunately, a mold was made of it. And the guy, Joe, who was making the mold, he sprayed some kind of chemical onto the skull so it wouldn't stick to the mold. And the hair, and within 5 minutes, the hair went from being strawberry blonde to that darker color. But on the left-hand side is a 1-year-old normal human baby. On the right, a 20-month-old Paracas. And even their god, who's called Khan. That's where Khan Tiki comes from. Khan is depicted as having red hair. And many more examples of this in some of the ancient cemeteries in that area. Black hair will never bleach by natural methods into red. I mean, you can't bleach it to do that, but black hair always remains black if it's put into a tomb, especially this environment, which is so dry. It's a perfect place for preservation. So that's what archaeologists will say. They say, well, it's 2,000 years old, black hair turns red. And then you ask someone who's a hair expert, and they say, no, black hair remains black. And there's a blonde one. So in terms of standard academia, there were basically 4 maternal bloodlines that that wound up populating South America, say around 12,000 years ago, or more or less. That's being debated, but more or less you had A, B, C, and D, and B is the dominant one in Peru and Bolivia. So here we have the baby, and the baby was DNA tested. And the baby's mother was U2E1. And you can see there what it says, West Eurasia. So that means migration. And then this one is from H1, which is found in Scandinavia, but also around the Black Sea and Caspian Sea area. And there's the baby when it was still wrapped up on the right. And so the one on the left, H2A. And you can see once again the epicenter more or less is the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So we're getting a pattern going here because we had 18 skulls tested, only 2 turned out to be Native American, and all the rest are what you're going to see here. And even 4 wound up being unknown. So that was quite curious because what the DNA test does, every ethnicity in the world that exists has been DNA mapped. And that's what the program does. It simply takes the DNA that it's looking at and compares it to all the others and says, it's part this, it's part that, it's predominantly this. But in 2 or 3 cases, it said, I don't know what it is. So that suggests something exotic is going on. And then here you see, after we finally have done 22 skulls testing, the majority are, actually the 2 latest ones that we did are haplogroup R, which you can see is around the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, and also K, and U shoots off from the root of R, and J does as well. So those are the predominant ones that we've been finding. And so, I mean, it may sound like a stretch that these people migrated, but we have to entertain the idea because that's where the genetics seems to be coming from. So here you have the Black Sea area, and if you were, say you were under attack from someone who was trying to take over your land, how would you escape? The easiest way to do that is by sea, obviously, rather than running. So is it possible that they could have left the Black Sea? And if we look at the pattern there, and you see where the Bosporus Strait is, that could be an exit point into the Mediterranean. And then from the Black Sea, which is the top right, into the Mediterranean, if you follow, again, the predominant currents, that takes you on the bottom right, very close to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. And then from there, if you're able to get into the Red Sea, then during summertime, the currents will push you out of the Red Sea. In the wintertime, push you back in, or back and forth. And then if you're able to leave the Red Sea, then the counter-equatorial current will start to pull you eastward. And then from there, the equatorial countercurrent would take you off the coast of Ecuador. And if you're able to do that, then you wait until the 20% of the time that the wind blows south, and that takes you to Paracas Bay. So, if we look at the Black Sea, these are examples of elongated skulls that have been found there. And they're more or less contemporary with or a little bit older than the Paracas. So there could be, again, this could be further evidence. And these are the other largest elongated skulls in the world. One's in the Black Sea area, one's on the coast of Peru. And you see the one on the right, again, has that strange anomalous suture line coming down the forehead, which actually shows up in Peru. And this is a recent finding. This is a 2-year-old baby that was somewhere around 2,000 years old. And again, you can see that the skull is almost the size of the torso, so like what we were seeing in Peru. And these are other skulls that were found in the area of the Black Sea. And this is a recent find from about 6 months ago. And that too, to me, looks like very much a natural shape. And that's the actual skeleton that they found. And more. And also actually into Bulgaria as well. So that's the area I think is the possible source of these people, the Crimea. And as I said, into Romania and Bulgaria, etc. So there may have been migration into other areas as well, and then interbreeding with normal people over the course of generations results in the natural features disappearing. Because you find elongated skulls in Germany, in France, and even at Stonehenge, if some of you went to Maria Wheatley's talk. And this is also where cranial deformation and elongated skulls have been found throughout Europe. And the most concentrated area is, you can see, right in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And that was an 8-year-old child from Paracas on the coast of Peru called Cinnamon. And I think she's dated at 2,300 years old. This is the one that was featured on Ancient Aliens. And her DNA was tested, and it was K, which again takes you back to the Eurasia. So again, this is the standard idea of how cranial head binding was done, the flattening. But look at the difference. There's a cranial deformation on the left and a Paracas on the right. So the question is, what is the, again, this is a very long process we're working on, and it's going and going. It'll keep going. So we're collecting more data as we go, but whether they were, a subspecies, they probably were a subspecies that got wiped out. So they were probably Homo sapiens Paracas, because if you're a subspecies, it means you can interbreed with another subspecies. But a species can't breed with another species. There's too much genetic difference. But if they turn out to be Homo sapiens Paracas, then that's what they were. And so Neanderthal. So a lot of you will probably have about 3% Neanderthal in your system. So Neanderthal is a subspecies of Homo sapiens. And then also the recently found Denisovans. They're very attractive people, aren't they? But again, some of you may have Denisovan. And then this is a product of the crossbreeding of the two. So the two of them are subspecies. Successful breeding. And then Homo florensis, who lived on islands in Indonesia, they probably were an actual separate species. So there's Marcia Moore with an exact casting of the cinnamon skull. And she did facial reconstruction of it, and that's what she came up with, of what the original Paracas looked like. So to me, they don't necessarily look Native American. They look something kind of different than that. And that's photographs of the actual cinnamon skull. You can see again the bottom left that the foramen magnum is like way back, like an inch back from where it should be if it's a Homo sapiens sapiens. And this is her doing the actual reconstruction. So there's what she thinks the ancient Paracas originally looked like. And that's what she thinks the next structure looked like, because the foramen magnum is half the diameter of a normal human being. And so she thinks the whole skeletal system is different from Homo sapiens sapiens, and that the necks were much longer. So, now the look we're looking at is starting to me to look like a hybrid of some kind, like with very exotic input. And that's just another example. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to study a full mummy yet because they're all in museums, and because I don't have a PhD in archaeology, I'm not allowed access. But since I live in the area, you never know when things show up from people who have private collections that let you examine things like this. Also, the blood type. This was sent to me by a writer called Will Hart, and this was a study done in the 1970s. So for the Paracas, 14 samples were taken, and then the Nazca 5 samples, and the Inca 13 samples, and they were taken from blood off of ancient textiles. And everyone who is full-blooded Native America from Mexico down to the southern tip of South America are 100% blood type O. So here you see with the Paracas, 28%, 28.5% A, 7.1% B, 21.4% AB, and only 43% of O. And even the Nazca are curious too. AB 40%, O 60%. So obviously there was migration to that part of the world in the very, very distant past, because the Paracas existed from, say, around 600 BC to 100 AD, then the Nazca from 100 AD to 500 or 600 BC, and then the Spanish don't arrive until the 16th century. But this study was published in the 1970s, and as soon as the researchers' colleagues found out, it was ripped from the record. But Will was able to find a copy for me. There it is. So here, this shows you where blood type A is located in terms of high concentration. So you're seeing that the area of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea is pretty high, like 30 to 35%. And then blood type B, again in that area, reasonably high. So there was an ancient presence there. But you see South America, 0. You see with A, 0%. B 0%. And then O, 90 to 100%. And that shows the geographic distribution of the blood types. So South America, 100% blood type O. So these people had to have had ancestry from somewhere else. And you can see that the area of the general region of the Black and Caspian Sea show presence of A and B at least. And this is a fetus that was drawn in the 19th century that was 7 to 9 months old. Done by a master illustrator. And you see the size of the skull compared to the body. So this individual would have been born with an elongated skull and supposedly a full set of teeth. And then we have this one. This is located near Lake Titicaca. Finally, a complete skeleton to look at. And we're going to go back, and the curator has said we can take DNA samples from it. The funny thing was that I went to Tiwanaku and Pumapunku with a friend, Ken, and Ken was a physicist. And so he wanted to see Pumapunku because he wanted to measure the magnetism and all this stuff there. And at the end of the day, we ran out of things to do, and we had a full day the next day. And I said, well, Ken, how'd you like to go and see if we can find this museum that has these strange skeletons? And he said, oh, that sounds good, because I'm also a radiologist. So a radiologist is a master at analyzing disease and bone structure and stuff like that. And so he looked at it for about 20 minutes, and then he said, well, it's not human. And I said, well, what do you mean it's not human? He said, well, it can't be Homo sapiens sapiens. There's too many differences. And then my wife was poking me in the back and kept saying, look at the baby. And I said, no, like this is the first skeleton, full skeleton I'd ever seen. And again, look at the size of the skull. So finally I turned to my left and saw that. So there again, the skull is the size of the torso. And Ken, who's a medical doctor, said that was a 7 to 9 month old fetus. And so on the drive back to La Paz in Bolivia, Ken and I didn't speak a word to each other because he and I were just in shock. And then finally we got to the hotel, and Ken said, what do you want to do for dinner? And I said, I'm going to bed now, because my brain was about to explode. So the next morning at breakfast, Ken came in, and he said, I'm 90% certain that was mother and child, and that they both died during childbirth. So that means that's a baby that was going to be born with an elongated head. So there's the genetic proof. So compared to what the academics say, we're saying, no, it's all head binding. It's like, not with these examples. And then this one, that was lent to me for 3 days. That was a newborn baby. And look at the size of the head. And the arrows are pointing to the eye socket and to the mouth. And there again. And you see the neck is way to the back.